welcome everybody to the PackUp's latest packaging webinar. Really pleased that you could join us today. First of all, I want to give a shout out to Bradley Holmes of Lamprints, who emailed me to say he'd be listening in from New Zealand, and apparently it's 4 o'clock in the morning there. So hopefully, Bradley, you're on the call, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join us amongst the other people on the webinar. As always, make sure you get your questions in. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, so please get your questions in. We've allocated some time at the end of the webinar for any questions. The webinar is being recorded and will be available to all registrations by tomorrow for you and your colleagues to watch again. A little bit about the PackUp. I know a lot of people know about us, but I'll just spend 30 seconds or so talking about what we do. So we're a leading packaging innovation consultancy. We do events, obviously webinars, as well as face-to-face events, offering also technical packaging services, reports, and finally our Innovation Zone platform, which is a searchable and easy to use database of packaging innovations from around the world. Over 8,400 packaging initiatives uploaded at a rate of 28 a week, from concept through to in-market launch. Very much a global view, so we're tracking innovations from around the world. Really good for you and your teams in terms of inspiration and idea generation, and just basically keeping up to speed with what's going on in the market. So I said that wouldn't take long, and the reason we're here is to hear from Stanley and James. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Stanley Mitchell of Zampler and James Nelson of 2M Group of Companies, who will run us through the opportunities of plastic-free coating technologies. So over to you guys.
Great, thanks very much, Paul, and good afternoon, or I guess very early good morning to some of the people dialing in. So I guess quickly before we get into sort of the guts of this on coatings and how we can make plastic-free coatings really work, both performance-wise and commercially, which I think is a big part of what we'd like to talk about today. We're coming to you live from actually very sunny Milton Keynes. And if you look behind us, maybe James, the context for this is talk about what's going on inside the factory right behind us.
Yeah, absolutely, Stan. Yeah, well, good afternoon, everyone. As Stanley said, thank you for joining us. We did a webinar, I think pre-Christmas was the last time we came on with Paul. And we were a bit cloak and daggers about kind of what we could talk about with regard to our relationship. And I'm delighted to say that we are now officially partners with Zampler. So 2M from our site in Milton Keynes in the UK will be manufacturing Morro materials. We formed our partnership just before Christmas, and we're working together now with a plan to put in place scale manufacturing for Morro materials, with a particular emphasis on the coating side of the business. So we have an excellent strategic fit between what our company offers and the science that comes from Zampler. And we've also worked with Innovate UK with a smart grant to get support to put a £1.5 million investment into our site in Milton Keynes, which will give us about 2,000 tonnes a year production capacity to start with, running on an initial shift. But we've been working very hard with our operations teams here to actually get commercial sales ready. When we're now ready to go, we've been working with a number of leading packaging companies to get proof of concept on Morro, which we're going to talk about in this presentation. But yeah, really pleased to be here. So thanks for listening in.
Yeah, and it really is fantastic to finally be able to talk openly about this collaboration. Like you said, we were pretending a little bit last time that we weren't quite as involved with one another as we maybe were by that stage. But what's really exciting about this, and this I think is the important theme for this whole webinar, and that we're really keen to talk about with the audience here today, is we're really interested in practical solutions. Now, there might be very exciting technology behind that. There might be some really innovative and forward-thinking business models behind that, like the one here at 2M. But really, this is about commercially viable and commercially available solutions that we really want to emphasize are ready to go from today. So without further ado, I think for those of you who didn't come to the previous webinar or weren't there for that one, it might be worth just briefly introducing Zampler. So we are a University of Cambridge spin-out company. We were founded in 2018, so about 6 years ago now. And we've really been growing very rapidly since then. We're about 40 people at the moment. And really our mission is to develop novel, highly sustainable materials for the future. And that's reflected both in our B Corp status, which we're very proud of. We were the first university spin-out to achieve that, but also in the range of what we are branding Morro materials, which is what's being produced behind us here at Milton Keynes and what is starting to enter the market now. And we'll get a little more into what those materials are for, how we produce them, and how they fit within a very fast-changing regulatory environment. But broadly for the audience, worth understanding that this really is a core material. It is suitable for the production of things like flexible soluble films, microcapsules for beauty, cosmetic, and nutritional applications, and of course what we're here to talk about today, which is paper coatings, providing barriers and other functionalities to paper-based materials.
And as Stanley said, I think we talked about the strategic fit and the rationale and the fit between our two businesses. So 2M are a manufacturing and supply business, fundamentally in the chemical industry. We supply lots of material and life science solutions into the industries on the screen. A lot of materials that we use in different products have multifunctional purposes, and Morro material, as an example, is a really good strategic fit on that basis, because we have products that work in the personal care space, which brings in the Morro encapsulation technology. We have products in HI&I as well through our Surfachem business. So our collective group and European footprint puts us in a good place, and we have very good upstream relationships with large chemical producers as well as consumer brands. So really an excellent fit for the strategy that we have, which is really working on a top-down portfolio review, where we're trying to bring more sustainable technologies and products into our business that can service this wide range of industries. And I'll talk a bit more about the packaging fit, because that's the obvious one that's not on that screen yet, but it's something that we're working on, which I'll talk about.
Can I just ask a question about the partnership and how it sort of, how it came about? I mean,
Yeah.
So I think actually this is a great time to talk about that. And part of it is that combination of our experience really as Zampler as a deep tech company and the degree of research and the work we're able to do on things like protein technology, really combined with, I think, that expertise you were talking about there, James, around supply chain, supply, efficient manufacture of these kinds of materials. Because I think if we just have a little look at the screen here, what we're talking about is a massive material shift. And in many ways, it's a huge environmental crisis. And I think it's worth being clear-sighted that companies like Zampler are really good at developing technology, but it is going to be companies like 2M and others who are already operating in the chemicals and materials industry who are going to be capable of bringing these to market at scale. And I think it's that dynamic that's really helped move this quite so quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, I mean, to answer your question specifically, Paul, we met a couple of years ago, actually, at Rethinking Materials. For anyone who was there the last few days, I know that that's just happened. There's such a big shift going on at the moment, I think, in the industry. And I read a stat fairly recently, and you'll have to quote me on the source, but I think 90% of the what the chemical industry produces actually finds its way into packaging in some way, whether that's materials, components, inks, varnishes, coatings. And I think we've got such an important role to play there in terms of trying to transition and bring in new sustainable products and address this problem exactly that Stan's been talking about.
So when you talk about scale, what are you sort of aiming to achieve in terms of?
So obviously, Zampler started in 2018, as Stan said, working on pretty much a lab scale. They've got a lot of expertise with process development engineers who we've been working really closely with to bring, I'm calling it an interim manufacturing solution. So behind us in the wall, We've got an interim manufacturing process which will allow us to make about 180 tons of product towards the end of this 2024. But in parallel, we're working on an innovate-backed project to put multiple 1,000-ton capacity in. So that exact wall, in about 9 months' time, hopefully will be our biomanufacturing COE, which will be the main output for Morro Materials as we look to scale up.
Okay, and when will the coating be hit the market then? Is it 9 months' time or?
No. The coating is available now. We've been doing a lot of development work with packaging companies, manufacturers, coaters, and we're ready to supply now. We will be able to announce very soon some commercial agreements that we've successfully closed. And so, yeah, watch this space. There'll be some announcements in the coming weeks.
And so, yeah, if anyone listening is interested in right now trying or ordering the coating, please will leave James's details up at the end. But we have capacity and supply for this year to be able to provide sufficient volume for trials and manufacture. And I think that jump from pilot and lab scale to actual availability at a commercial scale, particularly with a company like 2M, who obviously is committing to a longer term production schedule, is a really important thing when we talk about replacing some of these complex specialty polymers. And actually at Zampler, we're really very focused on recognizing where our materials are appropriate and where there are other solutions in terms of plastic replacement. What we like to say is that generally Morro materials have been developed to replace the most polluting forms of plastic. And those are the kinds of plastic that fit into the red category of this chart, which is showing plastics leaking into the environment or uncontrolled waste streams. And actually, the difference between the kinds of plastics you tend to find in recycling or managed waste and the kinds of polymer that end up leaking into soil, marine, or freshwater environments is really quite stark. So it's worth being clear that Morro materials are not intended to replace bulk thermoplastics. They're not replacements for things like PETs or nylons. What they are a range of products developed really to replace specialty polymers, things like thin films or barrier coatings, which have this really high risk of environmental leakage, but play a really crucial role in the materials landscape today.
Excellent. I just thought you might like to know, we ran a poll at the beginning. I didn't mention it. I should have done. Are you clear or confused about plastic-free coatings in packaging? And 2/3 say that they're confused. So this is a very valuable session.
We'll get into that.
And I think that's a really big part of it, that confusion, but also I think where that comes from, James, and the opportunity that's there right now in terms of packaging transition.
Yeah, absolutely. I think many people, I'm sure, are aware of the trends and the incoming legislation, and we will touch on that later in the presentation. But the particular opportunity for 2M, as we see, is to really start leveraging our existing network and supply base and start bringing to market sustainable packaging solutions. So, as you know, any material item, whether it be a package or a laminate construction for a crisp packet, will have different components in. All the components play a role in whether it's compostable and recyclable. What I really liked and appreciated with the Morro material particularly is the fact that even though there's an existing product range for the encapsulation, the film and the other things, there's also an untapped potential for bringing Morro material into other areas and other applications. So what we're trying to do with the new business unit and the focus for myself is obviously sales of Morro Coating and other products, but to be able to offer to converters a toolbox which allows sustainable packaging to be produced in the future.
And also, I think obviously 2M's really well placed to understand that need and also to bring those different combinations of solutions to the market.
Yeah, absolutely. We have access to some of the main producers in the chemical industry through other businesses. So we kind of know what's coming down the supply chain, what's available, and we represent a lot of these companies in our territories. But you see also an opportunity to talk to them and understand where they are in their sustainability journey and see if we can influence and work with them to bring in sustainable products into packaging.
What do you see as the opportunity? You know, why have Zampler and 2M decided to focus on sort of paper coatings?
Well, I think it's a good segue to talk about paperization. I think that's a trend that many people are aware of, and it's driven fundamentally by incoming regulation. So PFAS chemicals typically used in paper production, very good natural barriers for grease and things like that, but they're known as the forever chemicals. So from an end of life and pollution perspective in the environment, a different implication. And we know that the EU particularly are cracking down very much on a lot of the legislation that comes in. Having worked in the industry myself for 20 odd years in packaging development role, I know that the fundamental technology with inks and coatings hasn't really changed in a long time. It's NC, acrylic, PVB, ink and coating based systems, which, you know, fundamentally are going to be changed through legislation and the UN Green Deal. So having something like Morro come in and focusing on coatings was one of the reasons why, you know, we see it as an immediate opportunity, because there's a general shift towards paper, and this is a really sustainable end-of-life product. And we'll talk a bit more about some of the questions around the confusion part, because I think there's an awful lot of greenwashing in this space as well, and we're going to be really clear about where this sits as a point of difference.
Yeah, and I think as well as that regulatory environment and that discussion around plastic-free, natural, non-synthetic, I think there's also a real need right now for solutions that meet those sustainability needs, but also meet practical and performance needs. And again, I think this will be a bit of a theme for the talk, but we have worked really hard at Zampler and also in collaboration with 2M and our commercial partners to ensure that what we're offering with Morro Coating is a really useful, practical solution. So something that is giving you the grease barrier, the water barrier that you require in applications like food service, but is also actually giving you perhaps some novel functionality, like we'll talk about things like heat sealability or other tailored functionality that's appropriate to different packaging uses. And I think, again, it's a real key point for us that this can't be a technology that just lives in the lab. I think scale-wise, we're already well beyond that. But also it can't be a technology that has to be too difficult for buyers or users to purchase and to deploy. It has to work, and it has to work crucially with the existing methods and the existing coating technologies that are out there. And I think on that note, this is really sort of the context set to start talking a bit more about those key topics around legislation, around understanding what plastic-free really means, not just for the Morro Coating, but more broadly as we start to see more products entering this kind of niche. And also get really into those questions of what can be done and what differentiates Morro Coatings in terms of cost effectiveness. But maybe just speaking of practical usage, before that, James, are you a little bit thirsty? Would you maybe like a quick drink? Yeah. So I think you've got there, we don't have a cut machine at Milton Keynes, I'm afraid, but we do have a stapler and a glue gun. So James has a couple of Morro coated boxes there. And I think, there you are. Have a nice Diet Coke, James. We'll leave that on the side. Because as we were saying, things like water barrier properties, things like functionality can't be these kinds of abstract properties that you can't go out and prove. And I think it's applications like this, as well as the innovative ones, simple applications like cup stock, food service, which are really going to drive a very rapid change in this market and what we're already seeing in terms of EU legislation. And also very much, I think, in the flexible packaging space, where you've got functional performance that's needed to maintain the principles of packaging, of preservation, protection, conservation, but offer real world performance. So that's always been the perception that, you know, paper is a different material to plastic. Plastic fundamentally has always been engineered to serve a certain purpose, and we can replace it with functional technologies like this. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good. So apologies for anyone if you see us awkwardly sipping from these square tubs for the rest of the talk, but we don't have any plastic cups, so that's what we will be drinking from. Okay. And I guess on that context then, I'll apologize quickly to the audience. I was once upon a time a biochemist, but I promise this will really be the only biochemistry of the presentation, and I'll let you know if you want to zone out when it's time to tune back in. But I think being clear about the science behind the Morro coating technology is very important, particularly because, as we'll be discussing, there is a very confusing chemical space here, and there's a great deal of confusion between older terminology and newer terminology, which is now defined in legislation around coatings. So what we really developed at Zampler is a way to functionalize common plant proteins. We can use a huge range of plant proteins, and that means we can take commodity feedstocks, things like pea protein, potato protein, but also things like byproduct materials. So, for example, some of the audience might have seen a recent collaboration with the cosmetics company Elemis to produce a cosmetics sachet, and indeed now moving into a paper coating solution for them based on proteins that are a byproduct of their existing ingredient supply chain. We take these proteins and we unravel their structure, and in a controlled way, we allow them to fold into new shapes. And really, proteins are quite unique among natural polymers in that it's this folded state that determines how they behave as a material. Now, this is the bit where everyone who wanted to zone out can wake up, because that does sound very exciting. There was some very exciting protein science behind it all. But really, this is a very similar process to something we all probably see every day, which is cooking. And indeed, at the industrial scale behind us, a lot of the equipment is more from a food processing world than it is a traditional chemistry world. And that's because really this process is quite familiar to us. If you think of an egg white, when it's raw, it's clear, it's runny. When you cook it, that egg white suddenly becomes very rigid, very opaque. That's a huge change in material functionality, but really all that has happened is the heat has altered the folding of the proteins. And that is essentially the same kind of process we control to get specific function and specific performance out of very, very common plant proteins with the Morro coating. And part of the reason that we are very focused on that and on not crossing the red line of chemical modification goes back to that question of what applications Morro materials are actually meant to be for. Like we said before, a lot of these are very highly littered or have very high risk of environmental leakage. And so the specialty polymers that we replace, we're very keen to be replacing with a solution that will biodegrade even in an unmanaged waste stream. Again, ironically, I think at Zampler we tend to say biodegradability is itself a slightly degraded term because it covers such a huge range of waste treatment methodologies. And I think it's really important to be clear that when we're talking about biodegradation of Morro materials and Morro coating, we're not talking about industrial composting. We're not talking about even home composting. We consistently test our materials to ensure they meet ISO and EN standards for biodegradation in uncontrolled environments, things like soil, marine, freshwater, and also anaerobic biodegradation in situations like landfill. Because what we want to ensure is that however Morro materials are used, we are never compromising or reducing the biodegradability of anything that these coatings are applied to.
Yeah. So Stanley, what makes your Morro coating so different then? What is it about? I can see lots of green dots, so that I'm kind of answering my own question, but you can just sort of explore that a bit more in a bit more detail.
So I think that's a really good point, Paul, and part of it comes to something in terms of definitions of materials, but I think the absolutely crucial point is the non-chemical modification. So at no point in the Zampler process, in the production of these Morro coatings, does any chemical change occur in the plant protein. And what that means is, sure, what we make looks like a paper coating or it looks like a thin film, but practically at the molecular level, it is a natural plant protein from something like pea or potato, and therefore, as you'd expect, very, very biocompatible and very, very easy to biodegrade. And I think to that point, maybe James, you want to
I think so. I think obviously we've talked very much about the impact of coatings and legislation, and lots of people are aware of certain things are moving now. Certain things are clear, certain things aren't clear. When I started to, when I first came across Morro at that event, actually, I'd done a lot of research into trying to understand a bit more about this space that exists around coating technologies, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next few slides. But yeah, you know, people might have seen Germany, Netherlands particularly are taking very firm stances on interpretation of said legislation, and actually looking at what that means for a polymer coating on paper and board, classifying it as a single-use plastic, which can change the landscape a lot, given the current state of things which are out there, which I'll come on to. So EU legislation is driving a major shift, and it's based on that definition that you referred to about not chemically modified being super important. And they're just the front runners. I think the EU Green Deal and the impact of that is going to continue to start changing the landscape, particularly around, from what we've seen in the chemical industry, a lot of the components that go into, as I said, conventional inks coatings, technology-wise, haven't changed for a long time. I think there's a big change that's going to be on its way, which is going to impact packaging in many ways.
Yeah. And I think at the core of that is this question that kind of links to what you raised just then, Paul, which is about what we are meaning when we say plastic free. And I think for Zampler, we have a very clear position on this, but as James said, because legislation is changing very, very rapidly, this word and this phrase is becoming hugely important. And actually, there's quite a bit of confusion, right? I think, James, we spent some time at trade shows, we visited a few places, we've seen a lot of things calling themselves plastic free, but particularly for older products, meaning quite different things.
There's lots of definitions. There's bio-based, there's compostable, there's, you know, is that industrially compostable, is it home compostable? There's lots of noise in that area, and I think it's quite confusing. I think the polls reflected that, that Paul did at the beginning.
Yeah, I know. I'm just looking at our innovation zone platform. I mean, we get all sorts of claims around the word, you know, variations or combinations of the words bio and compost and plastic free. So it's still a bit of an uncharted. It's still quite confusing, and there isn't a standard sort of set of definitions that are coming to the fore. Really.
Well, I think we've tried to talk, and we'll cover that. I think it's the next slide, Paul. Actually, the what's actually out there. We've tried to make it simple. It is an awful lot of ambiguity in descriptions, definitions.
And I think it will seem perhaps a funny story to the packaging experts on the call, but I can remember, obviously, coming from a biochemistry background, when we first started to get questions about whether we could make a coating, whether we could provide a plastic-free solution. You know, we did what any startup does. You read a few reports, you go to a few trade shows, and I think we found it very confusing because one thing that is out there right now are synthetic polymer dispersion coatings, which particularly in older sales material tend to call themselves plastic free. But what they really mean is they're an alternative to thick, heavy laminate plastic coatings. And I think that kind of historical language, which, as James was saying, is starting to change now with EU regulation, plays a big role in the confusion of what we mean when we say plastic free and what's within the scope of the regulation.
Yeah, this is a busy slide. Sorry, I apologize in advance for this. I think, but it is a really useful slide to just put out there what actually is there as existing technology. So if you focus on the bottom half of this chart, typically a lot of the conventional things used in these products are petroleum based, fossil fuel derived. The ones on the left are conventional polymers, polyethylene, polypropylene, used as rigid plastics as well, but available as additives to make coatings from. There's ways to make those products exactly the same chemistry from bio routes, so through something like enzyme technology that can break down complex polymers and convert them back to the virgin monomers that can be classed as bio. Polyethylene, also mass balancing that happens in the upstream chemical supply chain. So technically they're biomass derived plastic. The ones on the bottom right are sort of newer, more advanced technologies, but fundamentally come from petroleum based. And the ones on the top right are what I think is where a lot of the uncertainty is in terms of and claims actually. So PLA is quite a common product. It's bioplastic, but it's a chemically modified polymer, and that becomes really key. So one of the things that that attracted us really to Morro was that point of difference, because it really is a point of difference. The non-chemical modification, and Stan's going to talk more chemistry to you in a minute. But being non-chemically modified is such a key thing, really, particularly with the way the upcoming legislation has been interpreted, and it helps distinguish from what I'm calling the noise and the rest of it.
And again, Paul, I'm sure you see a lot on the Innovation Hub and on the Pack Hub platform, as well as out there at trade shows. But I think, again, a lot of the confusion sneaks in that top right corner, where you have things that may be based on a natural polymer feedstock, so things like a starch or a cellulose, but have undergone significant chemical modification in order to give functionality. And it's really, I think, helping move the industry now that in terms of regulation, that is a clearly defined red line that separates materials like chemically modified starches from this new category of natural polymers, in which you have materials like the plant protein Morro Coating.
Yeah. Cool. It might be worth now just sharing our second poll results, because I think it just adds, I'd like you to comment on it actually. So the question we asked was, what is the biggest barrier for you when thinking about switching to a plastic-free coating? Cost 20%, performance 63%. So there's a selling job there, a communication job there. Availability 9%, and greenwashing, reputational risk only 8%. So the reasons for not going ahead with a plastic-free coating aren't to do with worries of being greenwashing or availability, mainly performance and then cost.
And I think that's really useful to hear. I think certainly I understand a lot of the pressures on cost, and James will be talking more about that. I also think the greenwashing one, I can well understand. We like to joke that greenwashing is more of an issue for us in positioning the product than it is for some others, because again, as we talk about, we're in this situation now where there is a bit of a grey zone. A lot is changing very fast, but there are not yet really clear third-party standards for plastic-free claims. There are some options out there, but again, they work in different ways to different methodologies. Some do allow synthetic polymer dispersion coating, others don't. And there's a lot of disagreement, I think, among the people that come to us around purchasing the coating as to exactly what standard they're hoping to work to. I think what we want to be really clear about from a Zampler perspective is we really don't mind. And that we are very confident and happy to discuss in some detail why our materials are natural polymers from a regs perspective and how that comes through to the plastic-free claim. And I think it's worth talking about that a little bit here, because actually, although we've used these tools to develop our own evidence base and position, I think what we'd love is to see more people in the market looking for natural polymer coatings also starting to use or ask for these kinds of tools in order to get more out of the market and to force everyone to sort of improve their game in terms of providing truly natural polymer-based solutions.
Yeah, and I mean, it's really interesting feedback on the functional performance statistic as well, I think, because we've done a lot of work, at least in the segment of food service, to prove that concept of functional performance being feasible. It's absolutely crucial to avoid food waste and some of the other big issues, which I know are going to be challenges, but also it's going to be application and product dependent. I think fundamentally, most plastic packaging is engineered for a particular product to serve a particular purpose for a particular period of time.
Yeah,
we're almost having to rethink materials and rethink packaging in a way that allows us to get the best out of these functional products, but still be environmentally the right thing to do. And that's why we found, a lot of the approach of this has been a learning and development exercise as well. As we brought the technologies through from a scale perspective, it's also been making sure, looking at material selection, which ultimately then all influence cost, and then we get around in that cycle again of what's the most important consideration. So we can talk a bit more about some of the cost side of it, but yeah, I think fundamentally the functional performance is good enough. It depends on the application, and I think it depends on where it wants to be used.
Yeah, and I think those are crucial points, Paul. And it's great to see actually the audience is so far along in terms of what they're looking for. I think actually performance-wise, see us still got our little drinking cups of Coke here. We're actually very confident in at this point, particularly for food service, like James says, is a great match for this kind of coating. So again, really positive to see, I think, that kind of reaction from the audience.
Yeah. And what about other plastic-free dispersions on the market?
So I think there are a variety of products out there. I think, as we say, there are some, which I think if you expose them to the kind of testing on the screen here, you'd find it perhaps not plastic-free or non-chemically modified materials within the bounds of the EU definition. But there are other truly natural polymer solutions. And I think really it is performance that is our differentiating factor there, that we're offering not just very high levels of grease barrier at low coat weight, but also this ability to provide real liquid and moisture barrier. Additionally, I think part of the purpose of doing exercise like this, Paul, is we know quite a lot about the material. We know quite a lot about what it does as a barrier. But frankly, I'm sure people on this call know a lot more than us about packaging and what some of those functions might be good for. These are things still sticking just to barrier properties like oxygen barrier.
Yeah.
We know it's an excellent oxygen barrier, but we don't really know what that might unlock for someone in the packaging world if they could get their hands on it.
I think I remember from being in a brand role previously, I think we talked a lot about consumer relevant quality as well as being a really key consideration for some of these things. And, I guess maybe we should have asked it in advance, Paul, for the poll questions, but like how many people think packaging is over-engineered in its current form and then trying to benchmark new things that come through against it. So there's definitely a wider subject around the performance of it. I think functionally from the work we've done, as Stan said, we're very confident that this is a really good solution for replacing plastic in real world applications that holds a good level of consumer relevance and quality and performance. There's a lot more work to do on the innovation and the development side, and that's where sort of partnerships come in with brands and customers, and as we go through and learn more about these products, optimize the products, and actually bring new packaging concepts through to market as well.
And I think a big part of the value of exercises like this and of groups like Pack Hub, Paul, is really to get people thinking about different materials.
Absolutely.
Thinking about what they could do, how they could help replace plastics, how it might actually push things like paperization further in the industry, but also how the industry itself can start to take some ownership of the regulatory change that's going on. And I think tying this back to the plastic-free point, I think we all accept there are different materials, like James said, for different purposes. And we think Morro coatings have a really clear functional niche where they perform and are the market leader. But what we're really keen on is to ensure that all natural polymer materials that have that kind of benefit get really a fair inning and are not being side-by-side benchmarked against materials which are actually not plastic-free and are relying on claims around greenwashing or obfuscation about what those materials actually are. And I think, again, part of this is we would love to be quizzed actually more on the evidence basis for our plastic-free claims. And I think broadly, we have three kind of core ways that we demonstrate it. We're not going to talk about them all. There are things like gel electrophoresis, which is a very protein-specific technology and allows you to just compare proteins in a sort of input and an output of the sampler process. We also have compositional analysis, which anyone can do on an ingredients list. We've had that done and approved by an EU body in terms of compliance. But I think the technique, it would be great to take a little bit of time to talk about in terms of plastic-free, because A, it's quite nice and visual, but also B, because anyone on this call should be able to go out and ask for this kind of evidence for any kind of coating that they're being presented. And interpreting it really is, as we'll see, very, very straightforward. And that's IR spectroscopy. So again, I'm not going to drone on about the science behind it. Very crudely, you shine infrared light at a sample of any material you like. Different chemical bonds absorb infrared light differently. And from that, you end up getting a sort of graphical representation of the chemical bonds in that material. And what's really useful about this is that it allows you to show or to test for chemical modification, because when you modify, say, monomers into a polymer, you don't change the chemical elements that are present, but what you do change is this arrangement of bonding. So what you can use IR spectroscopy to do is validate that feedstock materials that went into a coating are still chemically unaltered when they're being used as a coating, and do that simply by comparing the shape of two charts and making sure that the peaks in that chart align. And I think Morro Coating is a good learning experience for everyone on the call, even if you end up using a different coating solution, because the IR spectroscopy is extremely clear. So this is an example that we had done recently by an IR lab at the University of Cambridge. And I think you can see here the incredible degree of alignment. The really eagle-eyed or people zooming in at home might be able to see there are actually two lines on this chart. There's a green one, which is all of the feedstock material, and there's a yellow one, which is the functionalized Morro coating. And the real point here is these lines overlap. The peaks are not shifted. There's no chemical change that's occurred in this material. And this is a test that you can take and apply to any kind of coating product that you're being presented. And it's a very common technique. We use the University of Cambridge because they're nearby, but any kind of testing lab should be able to offer you access to this. And indeed, coating suppliers should be able to provide this level of guarantee. So I think that's the end of the sort of chemistry side and the regulatory side around plastic-free and around how the Morro coating positions. And in effect, we kind of get to the more important slide given to that point about performance. And I think we're very keen to understand performance as a function of cost in use, because it always comes down to how much coating do you need to apply? What does it take to get that coating down well? And I think this is an area we've really been focusing on, right, James?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we've done a lot of work to make sure that the product will function in the range of industry applications that already exist out there. So if, you know, in terms of application methods for the coating, working within legacy industrial equipment, so coating machines, printing machines, that you'll recognize some of the techniques on there, pretty much cover the wide spectrum of application methods. One of the key things around the cost base, and I'll talk a bit more about cost in a second and how we've rationalized it, is that there's a lot of people on the call probably who maybe buy packaging or are involved in the purchase of packaging. Lots of things will go into the cost base that goes into that. People who make packaging will want to typically utilize their assets as much as possible and sweat them. And so we've done a lot of work with a number of different companies to ensure that these products work at scale, work at speed, and that really allows us to then get a drop-in cost-effective solution. Some of the other functional properties, obviously key to coating performance, are things like coefficient of friction and slip. These have a big impact on downstream packaging, high-speed packing lines. And also it needs to be robust enough to still be good quality and functionally perform, like the example with the coat box here. After going through a number of downstream additional processes after the coating's been applied, so corrugation, die cutting and creasing, slitting and sheeting, typical downstream finishing processes that you would expect to see for fibre and carton-based packaging production.
And I think that's a really relevant point, James, because again, materials innovation is one thing, but I think it's important to realise that really the material solutions of tomorrow are going to be run pretty much on the capital equipment that's installed today. And it is going to have to be the current coaters, operators, manufacturers that have to deploy this. So this has to be a solution that makes sense for them practically as well as economically.
Yeah. So as we touched on cost in use, I'm going to try and talk through a practical example, which hopefully gives the audience a bit of an understanding of how we've structured this really. So obviously we can use our box here as an example, for example. Obviously there's cost built into raw materials, there's cost built into the overhead costs to actually make convert the product, and there's coating costs that go with that. So that we're calling it coating chemistry cost. In this example, we've used a conventional dispersion coating just for ease of use, but I'm talking here about PE type, mass-produced, low-priced coatings that functionally do a great job for what they need, but are exempt from or will be liable for certain legislations which will have a bigger impact to cost. So typically, and again, I've used very, very broad brush numbers. It's going to be dependent on coat weight applied, types of material used, but you're looking at roughly 0.01 unit pence cost per unit.
And I think actually part of that, James, is, I guess from Xamp's perspective, when we came into this, we were thinking a lot about chemistry cost. But as this has actually moved a lot further down, it's that context of what the chemistry cost is in terms of the overall cost of board conversion, all those factors, like you said, where we don't want to be influencing that. You know, a 5%, a 10%, a 50% change in chemistry coating cost is one thing. Even a 1% change in the cost of processing the box as a whole, through failure rate, through fault, through slip, has a massive impact because it's such a big cost basis for the overall product.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then there'll be certain costs that are fixed. I mean, companies will depreciate capital over different periods of time. That'll be a fixed cost base to all intents and purposes. We just want to demonstrate here that when you bring in additional things like regulation, EPR, is still to be fully understood. But it is going to be an overhead cost and a burden to brands and packaging producers. So cost of production, if you want to look at it on a unit cost level, is going to be higher because you're going to have people and resources needed to ensure compliance and work with that.
And I think that's maybe the pushback we often get, although interesting to hear a slightly different view from some of the audience focused on performance. Because I think this is an industry where it feels like more and more cost burden is being added in terms of compliance, things like EPR, which are going to apply regardless of coating material, as well as constraints around supply, higher and higher performance requirements. So I think in that context, it's important to talk about cost and use for the Morro Coating on that sort of unit basis, and why chemistry cost is maybe not the be all and end all.
No, absolutely. I think because it's very easy to get focused and transfixed on a unit cost or a cost per kilo. We are sub premium to, from a pricing perspective, if you look at it on an individual basis, above what we call a conventional dispersion coating. Now I know purchasing people will be very focused on these types of things, but when I consider the other impacts, and if you look at the example for the Netherlands where additional legislation has come in, we've tried to simulate what actual cost of ownership could be when you look at plastic free as an option, because there's going to be additional costs for things like the SUPD levies, which could be between 0.01 and 0.05 per unit on cost. Now these are figures we took from the Netherlands as an example and worked through for the purpose of this, but also you know, again, regulatory compliance and additional burden that will go into ensuring that reporting and compliance will be an ongoing thing. There'll be certain parts of that all companies will have to do anyway, but for the purpose of this, we're trying to really drive the idea of think about, you know, choices made and then total cost of ownership for these types of products.
And I think that's interesting because, again, from our originally relatively naive perspective as Xampler, we were quite interested to understand where all this pull was coming from to work in paper coatings. And it really is this regulatory shift, as James, you talked about earlier, and the fact that now polymer coated paper and board is in some cases being considered a single-use plastic item and is getting subjected to these per unit levies, the amount of which is way out of proportion to the weight of polymer that's being used in these applications. I think we've also generally talked about dispersion coatings here. But I guess another real point that ties into that performance is that generally now for our commercial partners, we're working at quite low coat weights, even relative to conventional dispersions. And again, that goes back to the processability point, to that practical industrial use. And it also links in with the question, of functional performance and getting away from things like laminates, where actually lamination may not be necessary to get the kind of practical use that you need out of a product.
Guys, we've got 21 questions, which obviously
21 questions, I'm sure.
Yeah. So are we able to sort of
yeah, we can wrap up and then get to Q&A. And
I just keen to get some of these questions, and we'll make sure that all the other questions are answered.
I think we got some pretty straightforward sides, but I think, like James was saying, we understand that chemistry cost is a big factor for purchasing. I think, as James explained, there are other or wider cost considerations now. The other point is also about positioning within the market and the recognition that this regulatory change towards recognizing polymer-coated papers as single-use plastic is also, in some cases, going to come with significant branding considerations. Things like carrying or being obliged to carry marks like that on the screen, and how this affects the positioning of paper-based products. And I know that often when we talk about biomaterials or polymer replacement, it can be in a slightly negative voice, a bit like this slide, in fact. And we talk a lot about avoiding the pain or the additional costs of some of these things. But in this market with so much shifting, I think it's also really important to recognize it can be a positive story and a real positive opportunity to seize the initiative. And that's what I think we're hoping to promote and support with the Morro mark, which is a way for brands not just to avoid an unsightly and negative marking, but actually to indicate to customers that this area, this problem they're suddenly being made aware of, is actually something that some brands are working to solve and some manufacturers are already making the right choices around.
Yeah.
And to tie into that, and hopefully to some of those questions, particularly around performance, like James was saying, we do a lot right now in straightforward food service. So boxes, trays, greaseproof papers, that kind of thing. But there is also a real positive opportunity here to think differently about alternative packaging. And that comes down to things like the sachets on the right, which are exploiting the heat sealability of Morro Coating. So that's a white craft paper with the Morro coat. But because it's a heat sealable natural coating, that paper can then be run through sachet forming lines, pouch formers, etc. And I think it's really not just about this question of avoiding pain, but about recognizing the opportunities that are out there to be seized with this kind of natural polymer coating.
That's back to my reference of a portfolio and a toolbox for innovation.
Exactly.
There's a lot of things we can still do that are unproven.
And I think some things like performance, I mean, again, if anyone's interested in trying, please get in touch with James. But again, our little boxes of Coke are holding strong here at the 40-minute mark or so. But if there are other metrics of performance, we're really keen to hear from people in the industry about what it is we should be demonstrating, testing to make these materials useful for them. And on that note, we're now up to 29 questions, Paul. It'll probably be 30.
Yeah. Well, so should we crack on and get two or three?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you can stop sharing the screen, and people can sort of see more of you, and you can show maybe your demo in.
Yeah, sorry, just for anyone who's keeping track, James has barely drunk his box cola, but the box itself is in perfect state, whereas I've managed to just about empty mine, so I'm going to top it back up while we do the questions, if that's all right.
So obviously I'm just going to have to skim through and just sort of choose questions. I'm never going to get through 29. So what definition of plastic are you using when you claim plastic free? I mean, that's a really good question because we hear it all the time. So maybe not a quick answer, but are you able to sort of flesh that out a little bit?
It's not a quick answer, but I think it's really is an important topic. And really, I think we've been given a lot of clarity, everyone in this industry, by the new EU regulation, and specifically their definition of natural polymers as opposed to plastic materials. And really that plays into why we stick to that red line of non-chemical modification. So we fall into that bucket of non-chemically modified natural polymer because our materials are simply natural plant proteins. I think what the definition has created is a much clearer line, which says, for some other companies, if you do take a biomaterial, but you start to chemically modify it, you cross-link it, you polymerize, you hydrolyze it, that becomes a bioplastic of some kind. Whereas Morro materials are exactly the original protein that's used to form the coating.
Okay, very, very good answer for one that could take 10 minutes. Well done.
And if anyone would like to take 10 minutes, 15 minutes talking about regulations, please give me an email after the call.
What we will do, we now got 33 questions, so we'll if with your permission, we will go through all of these and answer them and publish them as outputs of the webinar. Someone mentioned about you previously that you proposed a Morro grade for extrusion lamination.
So I think thermoplastics is a really big area, and I think this goes to that industrial compatibility. So we absolutely are working on things like thermoplastic versions of these protein materials. But right now, what's commercially available and what's available at scale are these dispersion-based coatings. So watch this space for things like extrusion laminates, but aqueous dispersion really is the focus for the minute.
Excellent. Okay, I think we've probably got time for one more question, which is, has the coating been tested on paper through a repulping process at a mill?
Yeah, so we have done recyclability and repulp testing. We've done this with a number of partners, and I think we're hoping to publish some results around that in the next couple of months. Again, the non-confidential element is straightforwardly that it is repulpable and recyclable, and we're very confident to get certification of that. I think, again, because fundamentally we are talking about very low coat weight materials here in all the applications we currently target.
Which is from food waste as well.
Yes, and I think that's actually a crucial point, Paul, that again, worth recognizing that coatings on food service particularly are generally destined for other end of life because of the soiling and the contamination. And that's where that biodegradability element really is still key, that this is a coating that will degrade in a composting or a food waste related stream.
Okay, excellent. Right. That sort of round thing that was sort of 1 minute to the hour. I think we've had a record amount of questions. We normally get 5 to 10. We've got 37. So I think that's a reflection on the interest in the subject, but also the need to know more. And I think that's reflected in our third poll, which is, do you still think there is a barrier for you when switching to plastic-free coatings? And nearly 80% are saying yes. So despite all the fantastic things you're saying, there's still barriers there that people need to understand. So I think
it's a very complex area as well, and there's lots of considerations, you know.
Yeah, but brilliant. So thank you.
Yeah, happy to talk to anybody who would want to follow up and learn more.
And I think if one of those barriers is just getting your hand on the material, as I think I can see from a few of those questions,
that's
we're in a position to solve that one.
Yeah, so as part of the outputs, obviously get a recording of this video. We'll also make sure those questions are answered in an appropriate way. So thank you all very much. Thank you, James and Stanley, for your an hour of expert chat about all things plastic-free coatings. I really appreciate that. Our next webinar is Thursday, the 20th of June. It's a bit different. It's looking at Sheffield Hallam University's apprentice scheme. So more information on that. So thank you for everybody for your attention and your attendance, and see you again next time. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you, everybody.